Corps of Engineers, $7 billion. You get rid of NASA completely, $27 billion. National Science Foundation, get rid of it, $11 billion. Okay, now here's the problem. You still have interest on the debt, $892 billion. So what we have to do is we have to go into defense and start getting rid of that. $842 billion, get rid of Homeland Security of $60 billion, and the Veterans Administration of $170 billion. Then you have $1,038 billion. But even if you add it all up, you're not even close to $2 trillion. So my problem I have with, hey, we're going to save $2 trillion is how now, brown cow? You have to eliminate all departments of the US and you still owe $890 billion in interest annually. So because the math doesn't add up, and we know the United States is math challenged, otherwise Las Vegas wouldn't be the fastest growing city in the United States. We need somebody who can comprehend this huge problem and possibly give us some solution. And that's the Honorable David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. I added it up, David, and it just doesn't add up. As they say in Pawn Stars, it ain't happening, especially when you have interest on the debt of $892 billion. I want to know, and I know you're testifying in Congress twice this month, how are you going to get close to $2 trillion in cuts when you'd have to eliminate almost all government agencies completely, not reduce them, eliminate them, and cut, I think you have to cut the budget in half when it comes to defense, and you're still not there because of the $892 billion in interest. So has anyone ever put a pencil to the paper and took a look at this problem? I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know what you're going to tell these people in Congress. It's not bad news. It's absolutely horrible news. So all ears listening to how you're going to save us $2 trillion when, as they say in Pawn Stars, it ain't happening.
Well, as you know, Nick, the United States is not top 25 in the world in math. And in fact, we're slipping. We're getting worse as years go by. And I would respectfully suggest that Congress is not much better, if better at all, with regard to the general population on math. I think it's important to understand what did Elon Musk mean when he said $2 trillion? Is he talking about $2 trillion in 1 year, which, as you've demonstrated, is totally unrealistic? Or is he talking about $2 trillion over some period of time? As you know, typically when estimates are done with regard to revenue and cost proposals, then they typically do it over 10 years. And so $200 billion a year over 10 years would be $2 trillion. And while that's real money, it's not nearly enough to be able to, restore fiscal sanity and sustainability. I am testifying as the lead witness before the House Budget Committee this coming Wednesday about our fiscal challenge and what are the things that we need to do to put our house in order. And one of the things that I will address, and I expect that I'll get a lot of questions on it, is this Doge initiative. And let's start first by talking a little bit about what it is and what it isn't. First, it's not a department. Candidly, the last thing we need is a new department. We have too many departments and agencies and other types of governmental organizations already. We need a lot fewer of them, not more of them. In reality, what it is an initiative that seems to be an expanded and expedited Grace Commission type initiative, which occurred during the Reagan administration, comprised exclusively with people who are not part of government, primarily from the private sector, who will end up looking for ways to improve the economy, the efficiency, and the effectiveness of the government from an operational and organizational perspective. They haven't released their charter. They'll have to have a charter. There'll have to be something through an executive order that defines their mission and their scope and their reporting lines. My gut feeling is they'll be reporting to the director of OMB, and that ultimately OMB will end up having to separate their recommendations between which ones might be able to be accomplished through executive order by the president, which ones will require legislation, and which ones may require a constitutional amendment. My personal view is if they rely heavily on the work of GAO, if they rely heavily on the work of the inspectors general, if they end up learning lessons from successful transformations in the past in the government to be able to transform and right size an organization. And candidly, the only one I can think of in the 21st century is the one I led at GAO. I don't know of any other ones that have occurred in the 21st century. And if it's properly designed and effectively implemented, they have an opportunity to save several $100 billion a year, because there are annual reports that are issued on duplication, overlap, redundancy, improper payments, and many other issues that are, provide a real opportunity to try to do something. I also think, as I said, I think we've got too many departments. We had to eliminate another number of departments, consolidate a number of departments. That doesn't mean you get rid of everything they do, but you go back to core, which is what the federal government is supposed to do, because it's gone way beyond what the founders intended. In addition to that, many of the agencies have gone way beyond their authorized authorities. It's so-called mission creep, if you will. In addition, we've got many agencies trying to address the same problem without coordinating each other's activities. That leads to duplication, overlap, and redundancy. And in some cases, we've got things the government ought to be focusing on that it's not focusing on because the right hand doesn't know what the left's doing. One side assumes the other side's doing it. In fact, nobody's doing it. We also have to be able to look at not just direct spending, which is, what most people talk about, but also backdoor spending. That's called tax preferences, deductions, exemptions, credits, exclusions. That's another $1.8 trillion a year that clearly has to be on the radar screen. So, as I said, I will be testifying on this. $2 trillion is not realistic. If it's an annual number, it is very much realistic. If it's a 10-year number, I think you can do better than 200 billion a year on a 1-year basis if you go about it the right way. And I'll stop at that. And I know we've got other people that are participating, and I hope and expect that we'll have a lively discussion.
Yeah, well, I can see the 200 billion, because just going through some of these departments, David, that they spend money on every crazy idea imaginable and some ideas that are not imaginable. And the thing is, they always call it an investment, but I don't see where the rate of return is. And I don't see any stocks. I don't see any dividends. They just say, oh, this is an investment, and it's not.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. You're exactly right. I mean, my personal view is that the federal government ought to have an operating budget, and it ought to have a capital budget. Okay. Capital budget is for investments. Investment meaning things that are intended to generate a rate of return over time. In other words, you're putting money up front, whether it be for infrastructure or whatever it might be, but you expect that you're going to get some type of rate of return on it from a broad societal and economic perspective. You're correct in saying that government, many times, they'll just want to spend money. They'll call it an investment, but there's a huge amount of waste associated with it, maybe no rate of return. For example, the infrastructure bill. We spent a huge amount of money, so far, and got more to spend to be able to put in charging stations for electric vehicles around the country. The last time they checked, they'd spent billions of dollars and only put in 8 charging stations. So, it's an issue that we've got to come to grips with. Let me mention one other thing. Look, I'm on the Defense Business Board, and I'm not speaking for the Defense Business Board here, but I can tell you that there's plenty of waste in the Department of Defense, in particular with regard to the amount of overhead that's associated with the Department of Defense, and the application of the use it or lose it rule, not just in defense but elsewhere. And so there's opportunities to save a lot of money in the Department of Defense. And then the question is, what do you use that money for? My view is, when you look at the Defense Department, you divide it into 2 categories: the tooth, which is warfighting capability, and the tail, which is overhead. The tail has grown much faster than the tooth. in the last 20 plus years. We need to cut the tail to sharpen the teeth. But even with regard to the teeth, we have to look at what's our force structure, what's our footprint, what are our platforms, because our threats are very different today than they were 25 years ago. Our primary competitors are in different parts of the world than they were 25 years ago. You now have total visibility of the battlefield. From space, you can see everything that's above the surface. The only thing you can't see is what's underwater. We also have an issue of, moving more towards unmanned vehicles, whether it be in the air, on the surface, or under the surface. And so there needs to be a fundamental reconsideration. And we can learn lessons from Ukraine as well. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, where you have the Ukrainians have been incredibly heroic and have imposed many more casualties on the Russians than the Russians have on them. And yet, from a traditional measurement standpoint, the Russians have much better conventional forces and a lot more manpower than Ukrainians do. So what do you learn from that? How do you apply that on a prospective basis? Just a few thoughts before we open it up to others.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to bring in the panel and reiterate the problems to our panelists, but here's the way I see it for the panelists. Okay, let's just say Elon Musk wants to get rid of departments. We eliminate agriculture department, save 30 billion, commerce 12 billion, eradicate education 90 billion, get rid of energy 52 billion, housing 73 billion, get rid of the Department of Interior, obliterate all these departments, labor 15 billion, State Department 70 billion. You only save 360 billion. Do the math. The interest on the debt is 892 billion. So you have to dig in further. So let's get rid of transportation, 27 billion. Let's get rid of the IRS, 16 billion. Get rid of the EPA, 12 billion. The Corps of Engineers, 7 billion. NASA, 27 billion. National Science Foundation, 11 billion. That's another 100 billion. You're only at 460 billion. With 460 billion, you still have interest on the debt, 892 billion. We're not even close to getting rid of 2 trillion. The only way you can cut 2 trillion, and this is the way I see it, you got to get rid of the Defense Department, Homeland Security, and the Veterans Administration, or reduce it substantially. That's 1.3 trillion. But if you added the 1.3 trillion plus the 460, you're still not at 2 trillion. So my question to you, counselor, you're going to cut 2 trillion. Elon, do the math. So I'm going to leave that to our panelists. Rick Rosner, since you have a high IQ and you can do math, you can do Mobius strip calculations. Tell me how, by eliminating all these departments, including the Department of Defense, do we save 2 trillion?
You don't. I mean, the fattest cat, the word is the military with an $820 billion annual budget. So, I mean, if you wanted to take a slice out of something, you go after, but nobody, that's not a winner. People don't want that. They feel like, I mean, there's plenty of fat to cut, as David said, in the military budget. But it's like trying to cut the military budget is like a judge who decides to parole a bunch of sex offenders. That judge is not going to get reelected. That leads to accusations of being, soft on defense. It's a tough thing to pull off.
Okay, Ms. Kim.
You're muted, Kim.
Muted, Kim.
Sorry. Thank you. I want to add that while you're trying to do all these cuts, you're also trying to accomplish a lot of things, which is going to cost money as well. And you need the military if he's going to do all the things that he says with the immigrants. You're going to need some more legal authorities. You're going to have to put in a lot more processes and procedures. I think a lot of the government offices that are in place are not necessary. But just because I think that they're not necessary doesn't mean somebody else hasn't benefited from them. So we just need to be a little bit careful. But I truly believe, after reviewing some of the bid systems, that our military misuses the funds tremendously. I think that they need to go to an incentive program rather than say, if you don't spend it, you lose it. And if you spend more, you get more. I think that needs to stop because there was a lot of misuse of that authority and a lot of things purchased, which I personally witnessed them purchasing hundreds of thousands of dollars of test equipment that they used for doorstops because they didn't need them. They just wanted to spend the money. So I think that that it needs to be, people need to be accountable. And I don't think that the accountable offices have done their job. And I don't think Congress is doing their job. We've got other problems starting to happen. Insurance is being limited now. Like they're limiting the benefits and raising the premiums to the point people are canceling them. Employers are canceling. I mean, there are just a slew of problems of panic that's happening right now. And, we're not paying attention to the right problems.
Mark, do you have any comments on this?
And not so much a comment. I did have a question for David and all along those lines and everything, because one of the things that I know that goes on in government and goes on regularly, and you even alluded to it, is the need not just to pay attention to the federal, but also our local and state and all along those lines. So I'm wondering, isn't it part of what we have to do, not just on the federal level, but even on the state level, is to get people away from their toys and everything like that? Because even locally, I know that the police department and other departments love getting the latest and greatest toy. And I don't know that you need tanks. Not saying that we have had tanks here in Durham, but I don't know that you need those kind of supplies in order to curb crime in certain areas. So don't we need to be looking at spending on a local level as well?
Yeah,
The answer to that question is yes. You need to separate between wants, needs, affordability, and sustainability. I remember when I lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, before I moved back to Alexandria, Virginia, they had an armored vehicle that they had acquired. Maybe it was through surplus, so they got a good deal on it from the military. By the way, there's a number of different concepts here. I mean, you touch base, Kimberly, on use it or lose it. That's a stupid concept that we've got to deal with. If you don't use it, you lose it, which creates very perverse incentives. Part of that is how much of it is 1 year of money versus multi-year money. You also have the issue of on acquisitions, to require people to go commercially available unless there's a clear and compelling reason not to. You're amazed how many people, how many times, the military services have gone out and built things that cost a heck of a lot more money and had all kinds of problems when there were commercially available options that were available, but they thought they were different. And I think we can also look at things like I did when I was at GAO. I mean, I'm a personal believer that you need as few layers, players, and hardened silos as possible. You need as few departments and agencies as possible. You need to differentiate between the functions and activities and how many departments and agencies. In many cases, you still want the function and activities, but you want to consolidate them. You also can look at, well, do we need regions? Does the federal government need regions anymore? If so, how many regions? Do we need as many offices as we have around the country? I eliminated a third of our offices when I was at GAO. Do we need as many layers of management as we have? I eliminated a whole layer of management when I was there. Can we consolidate a lot of things to be able to generate more flexibility and more accountability and less potential for redundancy and gaps, which I did at GAO. We went from 35 units to 13. And can we start focusing on desired outcome-based results and make sure that everybody's focusing on trying to generate those results, which kinds of come along with what Nick talked about? What kind of return are we getting on this investment? And in that regard, we still don't have a consolidated, future-focused, outcome-based, resource-constrained strategic plan in the government. We still don't have key national indicators that say this is what we're trying to accomplish. Here's how we measure success. How are we doing? How do we compare to others? These are management 101 principles that should have been adopted many, many years ago, and I will note have been adopted at GAO. and they are transferable and scalable to other parts of government. And Rick, you are being very patient, my friend. And I'm just wondering, have you applied to Doge yet, since you clearly meet the IQ criteria?
They want you to work 80 hours a week for no money.
I got it. So the answer is no. I got it.
My wife asked me the same thing, but she knew the answer. She sees how much work I do, which is about zero. But we also have to figure out how to sell stuff.
I agree. We got too much land. We have too many properties.
Well, I'm talking about being the world's source of stuff, which is going to be tech, and I don't know, immortality. We got to so in 1990, the GDP inflation adjusted was 6 billion. 2023, 33 years later, 27 trillion. That's a 4.5 times expansion in GDP. So, we're not going to fix all our budget problems, but we need to, one way is to look at departments and ask, is there any way the stuff you're doing can be turned into a way to make the U.S. more money? Like the internet came out of DARPA, the defense, the science fiction-y arm of the U.S. of the U.S. military. And I don't know how much money the internet generates every year. It has to be trillions of bucks. We need more of that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Rick, because one of the questions that I asked the head of DARPA is, because they are very innovative and they operate very differently than any other unit within the Department of Defense, I can tell you, okay, in many ways, which I won't go into right now. But one of the things I asked is that when we end up doing research that has a commercially available application, what type of return do the taxpayers get when we turn over that innovation to the private sector, which we should do? But what do we get? A piece of the action? Do we get some kind of royalty or whatever? And the answer was no, we don't. And that's wrong, and that needs to change. Mark?
Yeah, I got a quick question, but I'm also going to just kind of tease you slightly and everything, because y'all created something out of the space program, meaning the government did and everything, that I will never forgive, because it's one of the worst drinks ever. So whoever came with the idea of Tang, y'all need to get rid of that and everything, because one of the worst drinks that was ever invented. But I do know that came from the space program, and maybe they should have got royalties since it was sold on the private market later and everything. But my question for you is subsidies and all along those lines, because a lot of times, and actually Nick brought it up earlier about agriculture, and a lot of people are dependent on subsidies in order to even maintain their business and everything, whether that's business subsidies, technology subsidies, or agricultural subsidies. So in your mind, do those subsidies need to be maintained, or is that something that we can trim out? Because I know a lot of people that depend on those, both on the agriculture and the technology sectors.
They all need to be on the table, and you need to make a decision on a case-by-case basis, because, as I've said so many times, government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, undercut states' rights, lost control of the budget, is not managed for results. And so all of those issues have to be taken on. That goes far beyond Doge. Right. Doge, from my standpoint, is a down payment. And it can do some good work, and it can help us make a meaningful down payment on our imbalance. But ultimately, we're going to need to do more. And yes, part of it is to grow the economy faster. But the numbers that you gave, Rick, I think the numbers you gave on inflation-adjusted GDP, unfortunately, the debt's gone up much faster than that.
Okay.
Debt to GDP is at a historic level right now when you can count total debt. And it's still going up much faster than the economy is growing.
Okay.
I just want to bring up DARPA again for a second. Yeah. DARPA's working on quantum computing, which is, it's highly technical, but basically it makes computers 1,000 times more powerful. And that's what they should be doing. Here's an estimate that says that the quantum computing market might be worth $1 trillion a year by 2035. We need a bunch of stuff like that.
IBM is also working on quantum computing, but see, simple math is not really good. I want to point out also something for everybody to take a look at. Remember I said that if you look at these government agencies, agriculture 30 billion, and there's a lot of waste in agriculture. Commerce 12 billion, a lot of waste. Education the same, energy the same, housing, interior. I mean, some of these things should be just eliminated. It's still only 360 billion. But here's the thing I found interesting about our wonderful US budget. You know how politicians say, oh, we support small businesses, we support small businesses. You know how politicians say we love small businesses. We know that small businesses employ 49%, nearly 50% of all Americans. So the Small Business Administration isn't 30 billion, isn't 90 billion, isn't 52, 18, 15, or 70 billion. Here's the budget for the Small Business Administration, 1 billion. That's how much they really support small businesses. Like not. What gets me, David, is that in our education system in the United States, no one discusses the budget. I went through tons of college. I mean, MBA, JD, LLM, high school, everywhere. And the budget, until I got on your show, I never even looked at it. I had no clue. Yet it's 25% of everything that we do. It's a quarter of everything that we do because that's the US budget. It sucks up 25% of all your money. Yet it's not taught in any schools at all. And I'm afraid that the people you're talking to in Congress, I'm really scared. They don't have a clue what the numbers look like. And you're right, on our PISA scores, we're not even in the top 25 anymore internationally on math. So I think you have a real challenge, and I'd call it a basic challenge ahead of you talking to Congress to let them know have they looked at the numbers? It doesn't add up. And then I know Elon Musk is pretty smart, but $2 trillion over a period of time, I agree with you, can do it. In 1 year, my question is how now? Brown cow.
Well, here's the key, Nick. I mean, part of the issue is, again, over what period of time are we talking about? How do you keep score? The other thing is the numbers that you're talking about as far as these department agencies, I don't think consider things like loans guarantees, and other things. For example, if you look at the SBA, they have a lot of loan guarantees. I don't think that's in that number. Okay. Secondly, if you look at the education department, you have student loans, $1.7 trillion in student loans. That program needs to fundamentally be re-engineered. And the president's tried to give away several $100 billion of those student loans, unconstitutionally, I might add. So there are numbers beyond just what their annual operating budget is that I think we need to consider, because a lot of those loan and guarantee programs need to be fundamentally reconsidered as well. Rick?
Two questions. One is, how did Bill Clinton do it? And two, if you call something a tax, people freak out. That it cost the first George Bush the presidency when he raised taxes. Is there a way to pull in revenue that's basically a tax, but you call it something else and trick people?
Well, the way that Bill Clinton did it is, first, he worked on a bipartisan basis with the Republican Congress. Secondly, he reformed welfare. Thirdly, he didn't expand the government to add new programs when we already have more than we need. And fourthly, and very importantly, I mean, that was the .com boom, right? .com that turned into be .bomb in some cases, right? And so GDP grew dramatically. The stock market went up significantly. A lot of people end up paying a lot more taxes from capital gains as a result of that stock market increase and stock options, if you will. So he had a strong economy, but he didn't expand government. He also had the opportunity to right-size the military. We got a peace dividend, when the Soviet Union broke apart, the wall came down in Berlin. And so it was a combination of all those different things. But we're in a very different situation now. I mean, we don't have those same kind of forces working in our favor. And so that means we've got to make a lot tougher judgments. With regard to the issue of taxes, Reagan, who I think is one of the best presidents we've had and was my first presidential appointment, he picked up on what you're saying. And he said, people don't like taxes, but on the other hand, to the extent that they're getting something specific for what they're paying, then they should be charged a user fee. And a user fee is not a tax because you can directly correlate you're getting something for it. The problem we have right now is over 50% of individuals who file individual income tax returns pay zero income tax. 20% get credits. Now, and most people pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes, but they get something for that. They get Social Security and Medicare for that, right? I mean, you could call that, so the whole system has to be looked at, but user fee is what Reagan would call it, okay? And that's something that you can apply in circumstances like, critical infrastructure, whether it be bridges and roads and things of that nature. And you have a lot of public-private partnerships, that have adopted that concept. And, you have toll roads and you have toll bridges and you have toll tunnels and things of that nature, and potentially it could be expanded. One of the things that frustrates me, why the heck are we building a critical infrastructure for charging electric vehicles when we didn't build the critical infrastructure for gas stations around the country?
I would agree with Dave.
And what type of return are we going to get on that?
We have some questions from our viewers. Andrew Carr, he goes, how much authority will Doge have and weight will they carry in their decisions? This is from one of your viewers.
Well, first, as I said, there has to be an executive order to authorize Doge, and there has to be a charter that defines its scope of responsibilities and authorities. I'm sure that it'll be told, the agencies, departments and agencies of government will be told to cooperate with Doge. That'll be through executive order. In the end, all they have the authority to do is to make recommendations. In my view, those recommendations will go to the Office of Management and Budget. They'll have to be segmented into what can potentially be done through executive order, what's going to require legislation, what may require a constitutional amendment. The president then is going to have to decide what does he want to do. And then there will have to be efforts to try to move from proposal to potential implementation. So, as I said, they're basically a expanded, expedited Grace Commission on steroids, in my view. That's what they appear to be. But clearly, President-elect Trump is very much behind this, and the Republicans are very much behind this, and some Democrats are behind this, but you get a little bit of adverse selection. For example, Bernie Sanders is excited about the opportunity to cut the defense budget, probably is not as excited about cutting, certain other budgets. And so we need to get more definitive with regard to what's the scope of their authority. And then frankly, how are they going to staff this thing? I mean, this is a giant undertaking. How are they going to staff it in a way you can bring the ship into port and ultimately achieve some real results? Keep in mind the Grace Commission, they had like 2,500 recommendations, but not a lot of them got implemented, unfortunately.
We have another question from one of your viewers, is Charles Langdon. He wants to know, will they be able to lower the borrowing interest rates? If so, how? Because we have to borrow money to pay that interest on the loan.
Well, part of the issue is what's the state of the economy? What's the state of inflation? What's the Federal Reserve do? There's two issues: overall interest rates, and which you have to also consider, like basic economics 101, supply and demand. We now have an increasing need to finance not just our deficits, but maturing debt. And so therefore we have an increasing need to finance it. On the other hand, we have a circumstance in which some of our historical large lenders like China and Japan and others have less of an appetite for our debt. You have a circumstance in which the Fed ended up buying a lot of the new debt during COVID, which served to hold down interest rates, but now they need to gradually sell that in the open market, which has the opposite effect. And the bottom line is, if we don't end up putting our finances in order, we could end up losing the confidence of investors, with regard to our ability to do so, and therefore want to charge a higher interest rate. because of the risk implications thereof. So on that hand, we got to get our act together. And that's what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday, how to get our act together and what we need to do. Last thing is, I clearly think you need to look at student loans and whether or not we ought to be changing, the interest rates that we're charging on student loans. But I also think that we ought to look at on what basis are we going to forgive those loans. My view, they ought to be for service. They ought to be for service rendered. And we can define that service broadly. We can define it as either the military or in the government or in the not-for-profit sector or in certain occupations, whether it be healthcare, whether it be education or whatever, and in certain areas of the country where we have a big supply and demand imbalance, and we need more human capital in that area to be able to deal with that supply and demand imbalance.
What about,
David, I
what
spoke
about-
with some young people who don't have any parental help in managing their student debt or anything. And, I truly believe that the student loan system was entrapment to indenture slave our future children for the spoiled, rotten congressmen we have today. So I think that what we need to do is provide it maybe interest-free right now, help them pay it off. I think that a lot of these students didn't understand how the interest rates worked, and they were paying the minimum. And they, 5 years in, they owe more than what they did the first day they paid. So they did show good due diligence of paying, but now they're frustrated, they're exhausted, they're beaten down, they're not getting anywhere, though they've paid for 5 years. And I don't see why we can't go in and go, okay, you paid for 5 years, let's take a look at how much principal that would have been and readjust it a little bit. I think we've not been fair to the students. I think it's unfair to say they're the ones being spoiled, wanting something for nothing, because I don't think they do. I think that their future is lost because we had at least something to hope for. I watched people older than me get their houses paid off. They didn't have student debt because the cost to go to college wasn't that expensive. I watched each generation get to grow a little bit and build a little bit more than the last generation. And now it's exact opposite. The next generations are crashing and burning. Many of the kids are having to just throw their hands in the air and move back home with someone if they have that ability. So I don't understand why we can't. I mean, heck, you guys forgave the PPP loans with grown adults who knew what the heck they were signing. And yes, David, I think we can do something, and it can be done more.
Part of that issue was the government took steps that resulted in the closing of a lot of businesses. And there was a lot of waste in PPP. Okay. I have no doubt about there was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of abuse of PPP. I totally agree with that. I totally agree that we need to reform the student loan system. I totally agree we need to look at what interest rates we're charging. But I think we also have to keep in mind people need to think about what type of degree are they getting and how marketable is that degree. I think we also have to, look at, on what basis do we forgive these loans, right? And that's something that's got to be done with the Congress in cooperation with the president, because no president has the authority to unilaterally forgive student loans. Rick?
So what about selling Americans our debt via savings bonds? Everybody used to have a bunch of savings bonds sitting in their drawers. If every American carried, and they don't pay that great interest. If every American had $2,000 in savings bonds sitting around, that's 2/3 of $1 trillion. Or maybe you could do like savings bonds for education, where you pay, you buy these education bonds, the government makes a deal with the colleges saying, you're going to give us a break in what you're charging if the person pays through bonds. Is there anything there, or is that just all?
Well, several things.
Really?
One, and coming back to your point too, I think, there's a need for financial literacy education, which we've talked about before, and that relates to student loans and several other issues we're talking about. Here's the problem, Rick. Americans don't save. Our savings rate is incredibly low.
Yes.
We now have not only the highest debt as a percentage of GDP on total debt, in history for the federal government. Many states have problems. We have the highest credit card debt in history right now. And so intellectually, I hear you. We did that during World War II, but we were betting the ranch in World War II. That was a threat to our potential existence. In addition to that, Americans used to be more frugal. Americans remembered, who were living at that point in time, remembered the Great Depression. They didn't spend all the money they made more, and charge it to the future. They saved more money. And so there's been a fundamental intergenerational change, if you will.
But we have a salesman moving into the White House. Trump is still, he's selling $10,000 guitars, $200 cologne. His wife is selling $90 stamped brass Christmas ornaments. He could sell a program of Buy America bonds. He could even call them Trump bonds.
Well, that's what Japan does. I mean, one of the reasons that they've got such
take all the money
because they have a much higher savings rate than we do, and then frankly they're more patriotic about this issue than our country has been. My only question is, how much of that Trump stuff have you bought yet?
I haven't bought any of it because I know I haven't bought any. But
I found a better star than Melania's $90 star for $5. It's so.
It's called the profit motive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Temu, which we know is a Chinese company,
I have a Trump Tower you can buy.
The whole Trump Tower you can buy and everything. This is just crazy that you're going to buy Trump stuff. But I do have a quick question for you, and it's one of concern, and you kind of alluded to it. Is there any things that, because I know we've got to be very diligent in what we're cutting, and there's things that are very important that have to be cut and everything. But I can tell you as a member of the minority community that there are agencies out there, like even where you are in Virginia, there's the Minority Business Economic Development that actually helps a lot of minority businesses get funding in order to create their businesses. So are there any kind of agencies that would be resistant of the acts, for lack of a better term, and everything? Because I understand what you're saying.
I think the way that they're likely to go about this, if I was doing it from an intellectual standpoint, okay, one of the things I would do is I would start with the Constitution of the United States. Keep in mind that the states created the federal government, not the other way around. And the way that it was supposed to be is the federal government was supposed to do certain express and enumerated things, and it was supposed to encourage, not provide, encourage other things, all right? But what's happening is the federal government has expanded far beyond what was intended. In addition to that, I would look at the charters for, the departments and agencies, the different programs. What were they assigned to do? Okay, and what are they actually doing? Okay, how do they measure success, and are they being successful? Who else is on the playing field? What other parts of government are on the playing field, and to what extent do you have duplication, overlap, redundancy? What type of footprint do they have? I mean, what type of organizational structure do they have? To what extent are they leveraging technology or not leveraging technology? So there's lots of things I think you can do where you can end up still maintaining a lot of programs, but doing it a lot more economically and efficiently and effectively. And then you have to think about, okay, there are certain things that need to be done, but at what level of government should they be done? Should they be at the federal level? Should they be at the state level? Should they be at the local level? And yeah, maybe the federal government might be involved in trying to provide some matching funding or whatever, but they don't necessarily want to run the program, if you will. So I think, but I'll come back to something I'm really going to emphasize on Wednesday. We have no plan.
Yeah.
No plan, forward looking, threat and opportunity based, integrated, results oriented, resource constrained. We have no plan. We don't have key national indicators, economic, diplomatic, military, social, etc., to say this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is how we measure success. To what extent are we making progress? How do we compare to others? What's working? What's not? We don't have that. So what ends up happening, and Nick alluded to this before, when something's not going well, people throw more money at it.
Right.
You know, that's all they know to do. They throw more money at it, which could be, and in many cases is, throwing good money after bad outcomes.
You know, David, and I hope that I would love to sit in on some of what you are doing, because I work with so many young people now, trying to help them out. A lot of them right now, they're having their insurance. The employers are cutting the insurance coverage, medical insurance. They can't afford medical care, and they can't even afford the Obama medical insurance or healthcare gov policies. Those are very expensive. I've gone online and looked at those as well. But, you know, no offense to any of them, but we don't even have enough physicians anymore because they can't afford their student loans and they're tired. So, I mean, we're going downhill in a spiral, but this medical insurance thing is becoming a problem. And to have heard 5 times in the last week from 5 different people in 5 different industries that their medical insurance has either been cut or reduced or limited. And I will guarantee you now, because of the recent murder, that our premiums, deductibles, and denials are all going to increase tremendously, because all of the insurance CEOs are now buying security for themselves. So, I mean, it's just not going to get better for us.
Well, we need comprehensive healthcare reform.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, and it's in my book where I talk about the difference between what we need and can afford and can sustain, which is limited, and what people want, which is unlimited. And we are the only major nation that writes a blank check for healthcare. We've got a huge amount of costs associated with administrative costs that are just, you get nothing for it. Okay. I have been an advocate to say that we ought to think about moving to something, and this got 82% support from broad-based groups of voters, that we need to think about how much healthcare should be universal, that should be provided through a nationwide pool, publicly financed, delivered through the private sector, okay, focused on outcomes rather than activities, okay, with a budget, all right, which other countries have. And I think that is something called preventative and wellness, which you need to spread across the entire society, and catastrophic protection. No matter what the reason for the catastrophic might be, it could be an accident, it could be an illness, whatever. Those are broad-based societal needs. Those ought to be taken care of. And then the government ought to get involved in other circumstances where, you know, the military veterans, okay, where, you know, the disabled, okay, you know, the poor, they ought to get involved in that. But the middle, we ought to let the private sector work, okay? And I think, you know, with a number of other reforms, I think a system like that could be affordable, could be sustainable. And I think we need to step back and really look holistically. I also think we got to keep in mind, we're trying to hold healthcare costs down, and yet we're losing several $100 billion a year because nobody ever gets taxed on the value of the healthcare that they get from their employer. They don't get taxed on it for income tax or for payroll taxes, which exacerbates our fiscal problem, which disconnects the true cost of healthcare. People, you know, don't really understand that. Rick?
I just came up with a tricky way to get Americans to give the government hundreds of billions of dollars. Last year, the IRS issued $461 billion in refunds. All they have to do is say, do you want your money now, or do you want it put in a Build America account, and we'll give you 5% more if you leave it with us for 2 years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. One of the things I had to convince my dad is, you know, when you overpay your taxes, you're basically giving the government an interest-free loan.
Right.
He thought it was success when he overpaid his taxes. No, Dad.
Let's continue. Let's make it a rolling kind of grift on the part of the government. We're going to keep your money a little longer. We're going to pay you rates on the money that we're keeping that are below market, so we make a little money off your money.
Rick, would you do the same thing with the lottery winners and everything? Because maybe they can give us some of the money as well, since they make a.
Well, lottery winners are notoriously bad at math.
No, they're very bad at math and everything. I did have a because I just raised the question, and you kind of alluded to it, David, and everything. How much should we be giving innovation toward the private sector? Because a lot of times when we hear about innovation, even with it's like the cancer drive and everything, it is usually government centered. And I think that I brought on this show, and to be perfectly honest, I have no idea if you know he's my cousin's political affiliation. So he could be either I think he's a Democrat, but I don't know whether his partner is a Democrat or a Republican. But they're working on warp technology, but they're working as a private company and everything, and they've been working on it now for a few years and everything, because that's something that will probably happen in our lifetime. So how much do we need?
Faster than light travel, like on Star Trek? Warp
Technology, yes, it is. It is a real thing.
Well, that should be worth a lot of money.
If they can make it work.
If they can make it work.
Rick, they're looking for a test pilot.
Yes.
No. I have enough trouble driving a car.
All right. But anyway.
Also, David, I know it's premature to bring this up,
Sure.
but shouldn't the government also, I know they need to cut spending because they way overspent, but shouldn't we also look for unique revenue raising opportunities?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to tell you what they do here in Spain, which is quite interesting. When you purchase a house or you buy real estate, the federal government here takes 10% of your purchase price. So if I want to buy a $500,000 property, first thing I do, I write the country of Spain a $50,000 check. If I want to buy $1 million property, I write the country of Spain a $100,000 check. It's quite interesting, but it would slow down the problem they had with inflation on real estate, rather than manipulating interest rates, which is what they did. And this is a revenue raising opportunity. The other one, I think, to solve the immigration problem. The people here illegally, charge them a $10,000 fee. If they don't, then deport them, but just don't deport them for free. If they come up with the 10 grand, I'd let them stay. In other words, somewhere along the line, I know Doge is going to focus on cut. But and the other thing they have, I'll give you the third thing they have here. They have a net worth tax. Okay, it varies depending on what city you live in, but it could be low as 3.5 million. It could be low as 2 or 3%. With runaway rich people, which is what we have in Congress right now, we have in the administration, this is going to be hard to get through. But at the same time, like Warren Buffett said, if every company gave or paid in taxes like he did $5 billion, we wouldn't have a deficit. If the Fortune 500 would pay 500, but they don't, because frankly, like Microsoft, there's 400 tax attorneys working at Microsoft. They are using, or they had in the past, the double Dutch Irish sandwich, which all good tax attorneys know, to reduce their income taxes. And so what happens is corporate taxes are, even though the rate is an all-time high, but the effective rate is an all-time low. So Warren Buffett, who's the tightest person on the planet, said, hey, look, if every company like his paid $5 billion, you'd raise $5 trillion, enough to cover almost everything. So I think along with Doge, you also need to have unique revenue raising opportunities. But I know that if you talk to people in Congress right now about that, they're not going to hear anything.
Well, several things. Okay, let me first start with taxes, and then I'll go back to R&D, which was mentioned before. Look, we're definitely going to have to have more revenues as a percentage of GDP. Our primary problem is excessive spending. The public supports a much greater weight on projected prospective spending reductions than revenue increases, 2 to 3 to 1. Weighted towards prospective spending reductions to revenue increases, but we're going to have more. And when you talk about revenue increases, it means as a percentage of GDP, not in nominal dollars. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're spending in excess of the post-World War II level and going up. We're taxing a little bit less than the post-World War II level, projected to go up just a little bit, but that's under the assumption all the tax cuts expire. That ain't going to happen. All right. So we got to do that. Secondly, it's got to be through comprehensive tax reform. Third, you're trying to come up with creative ways to modify how we tax, which ought to be on the table. There's no question about it. You know, maybe you don't call it a user fee, but I understand what you're saying. You know, I mean, it's a consumption tax, right? I mean, most economists will tell you the most efficient and equitable tax system would impose a progressive consumption tax. And so, you know, there are ways that you might be able to do that in a targeted way, which is what you're talking about, that ought to be considered. Now, going back to R&D, there's two kinds of research and development. One, there's basic research, where you're trying to create breakthrough new ideas that could potentially have broad application. And the federal government does a disproportionate amount of that. The private sector does some, but the federal government does a disproportionate amount through DARPA and others, okay, NIH. And then the second is applied research, where you take a concept and you apply it typically for a commercial application to be able to make money on it, okay? Private sector does a lot of that. We need to differentiate between those two. And to the extent that the federal government is doing the basic research, it needs to get a return on that. It should allow it to be applied, but it should get a return on that. And we also need to differentiate under the tax code with regard to the tax treatment between basic research and applied research, if you will, among other things. So, okay.
I want to add something, David, because you had mentioned that we need to tax people who get healthcare insurance. And actually, the healthcare marketplace does, you have to fill out a 1099 if you receive any healthcare insurance through the marketplace. They do. You have to fill out a 1099. So the low income people who receive assistance getting insurance are paying taxes on that.
If they pay taxes at all, because
if they pay taxes at all, but it is going against them.
The people don't pay any income taxes at all.
Right.
That's the low income people. Okay.
I think you got to look for VIG every place. When you place a bet, the bookie takes 10% of your money off the top. I think we should put VIG on Tinder. Every time you swipe right, you owe the government like a 10-cent getting laid tax. That would bring in $100 million a day. RFK.
I would change the name of it. You know, service fee. That's a service fee.
RFK wants people to eat healthy, so put a junk food fee on certain foods that are bad for you.
What you need to do is get somebody from Las Vegas like Steve Wynn inside the U.S. Treasury to run Treasury, because Las Vegas figures a way to make money off of everything today.
Yeah, you can bet on the government. Bet like which is the next congressman who's going to go down in a sex scandal.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure Polygon and them already have those bets.
We need more revenue raising opportunities, but that's subject to another day. And I thank the Honorable David M. Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States. We're looking forward to your testimony. Hopefully we'll be able to air that on our network, but we'll just have to see how that goes. And,
all right, y'all take care.
Take care.
All right, bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Look forward to hearing about when